The first shovelful of dirt came out of that hillside on a September morning in 1872, and that's when Martha Hendricks became the subject of every conversation within 20 miles. She'd arrived in Custer County 3 weeks earlier with almost nothing. A wagon that barely held together, one exhausted mule, and a determination that made the other settlers uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite explain. Most homesteaders were building up. Martha was digging in. No, she wasn't putting together another sod house that would sit exposed on the prairie like every other claim shack dotting the landscape. She was carving directly into the earth itself, working her way into the side of a limestone ridge that overlooked a small creek. By the time she'd gone 6 feet deep into that hillside, her closest neighbor, a man named Thomas Garrett, who'd survived 3 brutal Dakota winters, had seen enough. He rode over on a Thursday and found her waist-deep in prairie soil, her dress tied up with rope, sweat soaking through the back of her shirt. He watched her work for a moment before speaking. "Ma'am, you're digging a grave, not building a home." Martha didn't stop. She threw another shovelful onto the growing mound behind her and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "Mr. Garrett, if I wanted advice on where to sleep, I would have asked for it before I filed my claim. But since you rode all this way, you might as well stay and watch. Now you'll learn something about how a woman from the old country prepares for what's coming." 4 months later, when the temperature dropped to 43 below zero and the wind screamed across those plains with a sound that made grown men weep, Thomas Garrett would remember those words. He'd remember them while he watched his entire woodpile disappear under 9 feet of snow. He'd remember them when his last armload of kindling turned into blocks of ice that wouldn't catch fire, no matter how much kerosene he poured on them. Martha was 41 years old that autumn. She'd been widowed for 18 months. Her husband had died of cholera somewhere along the trail west, buried in a grave she'd never see again, near a river whose name she'd already forgotten. They'd planned to homestead together, only to build something permanent after losing everything back east to debt and bad luck. Now she was doing it alone. She'd spent her first 2 weeks in Nebraska living in that wagon, studying the land, walking every inch of her claim. The quarter section she'd filed on sat where the rolling prairie began its climb toward higher ground. There was a creek that ran year-round, a stand of cottonwoods along the water, and this limestone ridge that faced south and caught the morning sun while blocking the north wind. That's where she'd build. Not on top where everyone else put their structures, but into it. She'd grown up in a village in the Carpathian foothills where winter could kill you if you weren't careful. Her father had kept their family's food stores in a cave system that stayed cool in summer and never froze in winter. She'd watched her mother preserve food in those underground chambers for 20 years without losing a single jar to temperature changes. The principle was simple, and Martha understood it better than most. Earth holds its temperature. Go down far enough and you find ground that stays stable year-round, usually around 50 degrees, warmer than winter air, cooler than summer heat. But she understood something else too, and something she'd learned watching the way prairie fires moved across this landscape. Fire needs 3 things to survive: fuel, heat, and air. Take away any one of those elements, and it dies. But more importantly, she understood that survival out here wasn't about fighting the elements. It was about using them. The neighbors started arriving in pairs by late September. First came William and Sarah Mason, who'd homesteaded 4 miles east 2 years earlier. They'd lost their first sod house to a prairie fire and rebuilt with a fire break plowed around it. William was careful and methodical, the kind of man who checked everything twice before making a decision. He watched Martha dig for about 15 minutes before he spoke. "Mrs. Hendricks, I've built 4 structures in Nebraska territory. What you're doing there, that's not how people survive out here." He pointed at her excavation. That hole floods come spring. All this nice dry earth you're carving into, it'll be mud from March through May. The walls will collapse inward. I've seen it happen to root cellars that weren't properly supported. Martha paused and leaned on her shovel. She looked up at him from inside the excavation. "Mr. Mason, how deep did those cellars go?" William frowned. "Maybe 5 or 6 feet at most." "And how did they support the ceiling?" "Cottonwood logs mostly. Sometimes railroad ties if people could afford them." "Railroad ties soak up water," Martha said. "Cottonwood rots within 3 years underground. I'm using oak beams I hauled from Pennsylvania. They'll outlast both of us." She drove the shovel back into the earth. "And I'm not digging a root cellar. I'm building a house with storage built directly into it. There's a difference." By October, when the excavation had reached 12 feet deep and stretched 20 feet back into that hillside, the skepticism had grown sharper. Marcus Dalton rode over with his son-in-law, a former Army sergeant named James Crawford, who'd served at 3 different frontier posts before mustering out. Crawford had opinions about everything, and the voice to share them loudly. He stood at the edge of Martha's excavation and shook his head slowly. "This is the most foolish thing I've seen since a private tried to cross a flooding river on horseback. You're building yourself a tomb, lady. First hard freeze. That earth's going to contract and crack every support beam you've got. Then the whole thing comes down on your head while you sleep." He spat tobacco juice toward the hole. "I've seen soldiers die in collapsed trenches during the war. It's not something you forget." Martha was inside the dugout, setting her oak support posts into holes she'd augured and filled with creek stones for drainage. She didn't climb out to respond to him. "Mr. Crawford, did those trenches have proper drainage channels cut into them? Did they have support posts set every 6 feet on center with horizontal cross-bracing?" Silence from above. "That's what I thought," Martha said. "You're thinking about military field fortifications dug in a hurry under fire. I'm building a house that'll still be standing 50 years from now. Different engineering entirely." She tamped earth around the post base with a wooden mallet. "But I do appreciate your concern. Makes me feel like I'm part of the community already." The design was more complex than anyone realized from just watching her dig. The main living space measured 18 by 16 feet, carved directly into that hillside, with the front wall set back about 5 feet from the slope face. That front wall would be thick sod blocks with a proper door and 1 south-facing window. The back and side walls were earth, cut smooth and faced with thin boards she'd salvaged from an abandoned claim 10 miles north. The ceiling would be those oak beams covered with willow branches, then tar paper, then 2 feet of sod. Standard dugout construction that you could find scattered across Nebraska by the thousands at that point. But it was what she built beneath the main floor that set her design apart from everything else in the county. And she dug an additional 5 feet down along the entire back section of the main room, creating a chamber that measured 10 feet wide and 18 feet long. This was her cache, her vault, her insurance against what was coming. The entrance was a trapdoor, set flush with the main floor, easily accessible but out of the way of daily movement. She lined the walls with limestone rocks from the creek bed, fitting them together carefully, and filling the gaps with clay mixed with prairie grass. The floor was pitched at a slight angle toward a drainage channel that led outside through a clay pipe she'd formed and fired herself. Gravity-fed, emptying 40 feet downslope, where water couldn't possibly run back toward the structure. The ceiling of the vault was formed by those same oak beams that supported her floor above, but she'd notched them in specific places to allow for air circulation. Not much air movement, but just enough to prevent moisture accumulation without creating a draft that would affect temperature. She'd done the mathematics sitting in her wagon by lantern light on cold September nights, working through the numbers in a ledger book she'd kept since leaving Pennsylvania. Nebraska winters could burn through roughly 1 cord of wood per month during typical cold weather, more during the worst stretches. A cord measured 4 feet high by 4 feet deep by 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of stacked wood. Her vault could hold 7 cords comfortably with room to access each stack without disturbing the others. That was enough fuel to last from October through April, with reserve to spare. She'd cut most of it from the cottonwoods along her creek, dead timber that had fallen during the previous few years. It was already seasoned, already dry. The rest she'd purchased from a hauler in Broken Bow who brought loads down from the Niobrara River country. It had cost her $38, nearly a quarter of her remaining cash. But dry wood in January was worth more than gold, and Martha knew it. She'd learned that lesson watching her neighbors during those first weeks on the claim. Every homesteader had a woodpile. Most kept them outside, covered with canvas tarps or spare boards weighted down with rocks. Some had built small sheds, but when prairie wind hit 40 miles per hour, and it did that at least twice a week out here, those covers tore loose and blew away. Snow buried the piles. Ice glazed every log. By February, people were burning furniture and fence posts because they couldn't keep their outdoor wood dry enough to light properly. Martha understood that the difference between surviving and dying out here often came down to small decisions made months in advance. The wood stored in her underground vault would be stacked on rock platforms she'd built 6 inches off the floor. Any water that somehow made it inside would drain away before it could touch the wood. The temperature down there would stay stable, cool enough that the wood wouldn't dry out too fast and develop cracks, warm enough that it wouldn't grow mold or mildew. The air circulation would be just sufficient to prevent moisture problems without creating temperature swings that would affect the wood's burning quality. The first snow came on November 4th, 7 inches overnight. Martha had moved into the dugout 6 days earlier, even though the interior walls weren't completely finished. She was still sleeping on the floor in her bedroll, but the door was hung properly. The window had real glass she'd hauled carefully from Omaha wrapped in blankets. So the stove was installed, a small cast iron model that burned hot and efficient. She'd chinked every gap in the sod walls with clay mixed with prairie grass, filling cracks she could barely see. The roof didn't leak. The floor stayed dry, and when she lifted that trap door and climbed down into her storage vault with a lantern, the air smelled like earth and oak and possibility. The wood was exactly as she'd stacked it weeks earlier, bone dry and organized by size. She brought up an armload and had a fire going within 5 minutes. The stove heated that small space to 65 degrees, while outside the thermometer read 22. She used 3 logs that evening. At that rate, her 7 cords would last well into spring. More than enough. Sarah Mason came to visit on a Sunday in mid-November, bringing fresh bread, and what Martha suspected was either sympathy or curiosity about how she was actually living in that hole in the ground. They sat inside the dugout drinking coffee while wind rattled the window glass. Sarah looked around at the earth walls, the low ceiling beams, the compact but organized space. "It's warmer than I expected," she admitted, "and it doesn't smell damp at all." "Earth breathes," Martha said. "As long as you don't seal it up completely, it regulates itself naturally. Moisture moves out through the sod roof. Cold stays outside where it belongs. Sun heat stays inside where you need it." She poured more coffee. "My father kept vegetables in chambers like this for 6 months at a time back in the old country. Potatoes, carrots, turnips. They'd come out in April tasting like he'd just pulled them from the ground that morning." Sarah glanced at the trapdoor. "William says you have a whole second room down there. Says you're storing firewood underground." 7 cords worth, Martha confirmed. "Nah, that seems like an enormous amount of digging just to keep wood dry. Why not just build a proper shed?" "Because sheds blow over in high wind," Martha said. Canvas rips. When a blizzard drops 4 feet of snow in 6 hours, you can't reach a shed that's 30 feet from your door even if you wanted to. But I can get to my wood without putting on a coat or opening my front door to the weather. She smiled slightly. Besides, the digging was free. On lumber costs money I don't have to spare. December arrived with temperatures that made November look mild. On the 7th, the mercury hit 4 degrees at dawn. On the 13th, it dropped below 0. Martha burned through half a cord that week, but every single piece of wood she brought up from that vault lit on the first match. Clean flame, good heat, no smoke problems. Meanwhile, her neighbors were learning the hard difference between dry kindling and frozen kindling. I'm between wood you could light and wood that just sat there refusing to catch, no matter what you did to it. Thomas Garrett rode past on December 16th and stopped at her door. When she answered, he stood there holding his hat. "Mrs. Hendricks, I'll pay you $10 for a week's worth of dry wood from your stores." "I don't have spare to sell, Mr. Garrett. I calculated what I need to make it through winter." $15 then. "Still no. But if you want, I'll show you exactly how to build what I built. Come spring, you can dig your own vault before next winter arrives." He looked at her for a long moment, his face weathered and tired. "Spring's a long way off when you're trying to burn green wood that smokes more than it heats." "Then I guess you'll have plenty of time to think about planning ahead," Martha said. She wasn't cruel about it, but she wasn't going to deplete her carefully calculated reserves to solve problems that better preparation would have prevented months earlier. Christmas week brought cold that hurt to breathe. 18 below 0 on Christmas Eve, 24 below on Christmas morning. The sun came up pale and distant, doing absolutely nothing to warm the air. Martha spent the day inside, baking bread in her stove, reading a book she'd carried from Pennsylvania, and staying comfortable in the steady 63-degree warmth her dugout maintained naturally. She used 5 logs that day. Outside, the wind was pulling heat from every above-ground structure faster than stoves could replace it. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned. Children slept in their clothes with coats on. Men went outside to their wood piles and found solid masses of snow and ice that required axes to break apart. Some burned furniture. Some burned fence rails. And some seriously considered burning parts of their own barns just to stay warm enough to survive until morning. What would you have done in that situation, facing a choice between freezing and destroying the things you'd worked so hard to build? Take a moment and share your thoughts in the comments below. Marcus Dalton lost 2 fingers to frostbite on December 27th, trying to split frozen logs with an axe. The doctor rode out from Broken Bow, a 40-mile trip through brutal cold, and amputated them at the second knuckle to prevent infection from spreading. Dalton would live, but he'd never grip tools the same way again. The blizzard that changed everything started on January 13th, 1873. Martha was hauling water from the creek in 2 wooden buckets when she noticed the sky. It had that particular yellowish-gray color that meant heavy snow was coming. But worse than the color was the air itself, completely still. No wind at all. The temperature was 11 degrees, which wasn't terrible by Nebraska standards, but that unnatural stillness made something tighten in her chest. She'd heard stories growing up about blizzards that killed people 50 feet from their own front doors. Storms where the snow came so thick and the wind blew so hard you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. She filled both buckets, carried them inside, then went back for 2 more trips. She brought in extra firewood from the vault, more than she'd normally need for a week, some and stacked it within easy reach of the stove. Then she checked her supplies carefully. Flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, dried apples. Enough food for a month if she was careful with portions. She filled every container she owned with water from those buckets. Then she made sure her door was properly sealed and settled in to wait. The snow started at 2 in the afternoon. Light at first, just flakes drifting down lazily through that eerie stillness. By 3 it was falling harder. By 4 the wind had arrived, and this wasn't the steady prairie wind that blew every single day out here. This was something else entirely. This was wind that screamed, wind that hit the side of her dugout and made the earth itself shudder. She watched through her window as visibility dropped from 100 yards to 50 to 20 to nothing at all. By 5 o'clock, she couldn't see the cottonwoods along the creek. By 6, she couldn't see the decoy woodpile she deliberately left outside. Stacked with green wood she never intended to burn. The thermometer outside her window read 6 degrees, then 2, then 0. Then it dropped below 0 and kept falling. 8 below. 14 below. 20 below. The wind must have been hitting 60 miles per hour, maybe more. It found every tiny gap in her sod walls and whistled through in high-pitched screams. She stuffed rags into the cracks she could locate. The temperature inside her dugout dropped to 56 degrees. She added wood to the stove and waited. 57, 59, 61. It stabilized at 62 and held there. Outside, that wind was creating conditions that would kill exposed skin in under 3 minutes. Inside, Martha was warm enough to read by lamplight and drink hot coffee. The storm lasted 43 hours straight. When it finally stopped on the morning of January 15th, the sun rose on a landscape that looked like it belonged on another planet entirely, and snow had drifted to heights nobody had seen before in that county. Thomas Garrett's barn was buried to the roofline. The Mason's chicken coop had vanished completely, the birds frozen solid inside. Drifts covered fences, wagons, outbuildings. The temperature that morning was 37 degrees below 0. The wind had died to maybe 15 miles per hour, but that was still enough to make the cold absolutely deadly. Martha waited until noon before she even considered opening her door. The snow had drifted against the front of her dugout, but because she'd built into the hillside with the entrance recessed back from the slope face, the drift was only about 4 feet deep. She could dig out. She could reach the creek if she needed to. More importantly, she could breathe. She had ventilation. She had heat. She had survived something that was currently killing people in structures all around her. Above-ground homes weren't nearly so fortunate, and James Crawford's chimney had frozen solid with ice from condensation. Smoke had backed up into his house, forcing him and his wife to choose between suffocation and freezing. They'd opened a window. The temperature inside their home had dropped to 20 below 0. They'd survived by climbing into bed together fully clothed, piling every blanket and coat they owned on top of them, and hoping they'd wake up in the morning. They did wake up, but it had been close. Too close. Sarah Mason's husband had tried to reach their woodshed during the height of the storm. He'd tied a rope around his waist, and Sarah had held the other end while he worked his way through the drifts. He'd made it 12 feet before the wind knocked him flat. Sarah had pulled him back inside using that rope, hand over hand, while he was already losing feeling in his fingers. His face had been frostbitten. His hands were white and waxy. She'd saved his life with that rope, but the memory of how close she'd come to losing him would wake her up at night for years afterward. Marcus Dalton, still recovering from his amputated fingers, had run completely out of firewood on the second day of the storm. Not because he didn't have wood stored, but because it was buried under 10 feet of snow and he physically couldn't reach it. He'd burned 2 chairs, a small table, and half of his cabin door before his son-in-law had broken through from the neighboring claim with an armload of wood that was barely dry enough to catch flame. The Hendricks family, Swedish immigrants, who'd arrived the previous spring, had lost their entire wood supply when their storage shed collapsed under the weight of the snow. Mother, father, and 4 children huddled in their sod house burning strips of tar paper and dried buffalo chips they'd collected the previous autumn. The chips burned, but they didn't burn hot enough. That family spent 3 nights in temperatures that never rose above freezing inside their own home. 2 of the children developed frostbite on their toes. Martha used 11 logs during those 43 hours. Every single piece came up from her vault, bone dry, split clean, ready to burn hot and efficient. The stove kept her dugout at a steady 62 degrees. She slept normally. She cooked normally. She read her book and never once worried about whether she'd have fuel for the next day or the day after that. When the storm finally ended and she dug her way out into the bright, brutally cold morning, the first thing she did was check on her neighbors. She found Thomas Garrett standing in front of what used to be his woodpile, which was now a solid mound of snow and ice 12 feet across and 9 feet tall. He was hitting it with a pickaxe, barely making a dent. "How much dry wood do you have left?" Martha asked him. He stopped swinging and looked at her, his face exhausted. "None. Haven't had properly dry wood in almost a month now. Is your family warm enough?" "Warm enough not to freeze to death. That's about all I can say for certain." He went back to hitting that frozen mass with the pickaxe. "Should have built what you built." "Yes," Martha said quietly. "You should have." The week that followed was recovery and assessment. The temperature stayed below 0 until January 22nd. People dug out from the drifts. They checked on neighbors. They assessed damage that ranged from serious to catastrophic. The Hendricksons moved in temporarily with the Masons because their sod house couldn't be heated properly anymore. James Crawford borrowed wood from 4 different families just to make it through to February. And one by one, in 2s and 3s, they came to Martha's dugout. Not to borrow. Not anymore. To learn. So Thomas Garrett arrived first, on January 24th, carrying a notebook and a pencil. "Mrs. Hendricks, I'd like to see your firewood storage if you're willing to show me how you built it." She took him down through the trap door. He spent 30 minutes examining everything with careful attention. The drainage system with its clay pipes, the ventilation notches cut into the beamwork, the rock platforms that kept the wood elevated, the limestone walls with clay mortar. He took detailed notes. He asked specific, intelligent questions about measurements and materials and structural support. "The engineering is simple," Martha explained, "but it has to be precise. 5 feet deep minimum for thermal stability. Drainage is absolutely critical, or you'll have moisture problems. Ventilation needs to be just enough to prevent dampness, but not enough to create temperature swings that affect the wood." Thomas nodded and kept writing. "I'm building this exact design come spring, exactly like you've shown me." "Good," Martha said, "because next winter might be worse than this one was." Thomas Garrett came 4 days later. He didn't say much at first, just asked quietly if he could see the vault. Martha showed him without comment. He stood there for a long time, studying the layout, the support posts, the way she'd integrated the storage directly beneath her living space so she never had to go outside to access it. Finally, he spoke. "I was wrong about you, Mrs. Hendricks. I thought you didn't know what you were doing out here. Turns out you knew exactly what you were doing, and I'm the one who didn't understand. Mr. Garrett, you've survived winters I haven't seen yet. You know things I don't know." "Maybe," he said, "but I don't know this. And I should have kept my mouth shut until I understood what you were actually building instead of assuming I knew better." He paused. "I apologize." "Apology accepted," Martha said. "Now, are you going to build your own vault? Or are you planning to spend next December hitting frozen wood with a pickaxe again?" By March, 9 families within a 6-mile radius had started digging their own versions of what Martha had built. Not full dugouts necessarily. Most already had homes they'd invested too much in to abandon. but they were excavating firewood vaults using her design principles, adapting them to their specific situations and existing structures. Some dug beside their current sod houses, some carved into hillsides like Martha had done. One particularly innovative homesteader named Wilhelm Brown built his vault under the floor of his barn, accessible through a trap door in his workshop area. The principle remained the same across all of them. Get the wood underground where temperature stays stable. Keep it dry through proper drainage. Maintain easy access during the absolute worst weather. Protect the single resource that literally keeps you alive through winter. The difference between surviving a Nebraska blizzard and dying in one often came down to surprisingly simple things. Dry kindling versus wet kindling. Easy access versus 30 feet of distance through waist-deep snow. Planning months in advance versus hoping things would somehow work out. The following winter of 1873 to 1874 was milder overall, but the winter after that tested everything they'd learned. January 1875 brought a storm that lasted 7 full days. The temperature dropped to 42 degrees below zero and stayed there. Thomas Garrett, with his new firewood vault built according to Martha's design, stayed warm the entire time. So did William Mason. So did the 7 other families who'd constructed similar systems. The Hendricksons, who'd chosen not to dig a vault and had instead rebuilt a supposedly stronger shed, lost their wood supply again to heavy snow and high wind. Same problem, different year? No, they survived, but only because neighbors with vaults could spare some wood to share. By 1876, word had spread well beyond Custer County. Homesteaders in Buffalo County, Dawson County, Valley County were hearing about the woman who'd built her firewood storage underground and hadn't lost a single log to weather in 4 consecutive winters. Some dismissed it as too much work for the benefit, and others recognized it for exactly what it was: elegant engineering that solved a fundamental survival problem using nothing but understanding and sustained effort. If you've ever felt alone in facing a challenge that everyone else seemed to dismiss, or if life suddenly became overwhelming in ways that made you question your decisions, consider subscribing to stay connected with this community. Sometimes the stories of people who persevered against skepticism can remind us that we're not facing our struggles alone. Martha lived in that dugout for 12 years total. In 1884, she married a widower named Robert Talmadge, who had 4 grown sons and a larger homestead 9 miles north. She moved to his place but kept her original claim, eventually leasing it to a young couple from Ohio. They lived in her dugout for 7 years and reported the same results she'd experienced. 1, stable temperature year-round, dry firewood always accessible, minimal fuel waste, maximum efficiency. The structure itself lasted until 1901, when the new owners finally built a proper frame house with milled lumber and modern conveniences. They filled in the dugout and planted wheat over it, erasing the physical evidence, but not the legacy of what had been proven there. The principle Martha had demonstrated, that smart engineering beats brute force every single time, almost spread across the Great Plains and became part of the collective knowledge that kept thousands of families alive through winters that killed the unprepared and the unlucky. Modern archaeologists studying frontier settlement patterns have found dozens of underground storage chambers near dugout sites across Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas. Most are collapsed now, filled with soil and forgotten by everyone except specialists with ground-penetrating radar and research grants. But the engineering those chambers represent, the understanding that Earth maintains thermal stability, that proper drainage prevents moisture problems, that accessible reserves beat distant stockpiles every time, that understanding is identical to what engineers use today in passive cooling systems, modern root cellars, and geothermal storage facilities. The technology didn't fundamentally change, The principle didn't change. What changed was that people stopped being desperate enough to dig 5 feet into the ground just to keep firewood dry. They got coal furnaces and delivery services, and eventually natural gas and electric heat. They didn't need to think about thermal mass and drainage channels and ventilation rates because other people were solving those problems for them professionally. But on the frontier in 1872, there was nobody else to solve your problems. Just you and the earth and whatever knowledge you'd managed to bring with you or figure out through observation and necessity. Martha Hendricks brought knowledge from the Carpathian foothills, where her father had understood something about underground storage that most American settlers hadn't considered. She adapted that knowledge to Nebraska conditions. She built it precisely and carefully. And when the crisis came, and it always eventually came, she was ready in ways her neighbors weren't. So the critics who'd questioned her that first autumn learned their lessons at different speeds. Some learned quickly after the first major blizzard. Some took longer, needed more proof, more evidence that what she'd built actually worked, as well as she'd claimed. But eventually, they all came around to understanding that mockery is cheap and survival is expensive. The man who calls you foolish in September might be begging to borrow your dry kindling by January. The neighbors who laugh at your methods in autumn might be digging their own versions by March. That transformation from skepticism to respect to direct imitation. That's how knowledge spreads on the frontier, not through books or formal lectures or university courses, through survival, through proof, through a 43-hour blizzard at 37 below zero, when the difference between your family living and dying comes down to whether you can start a fire with the first match. So Martha died in 1909 at the age of 78, survived by her second husband, 9 stepchildren, and a reputation as someone who'd understood practical engineering before most men in Custer County knew what the word meant in practical terms. Her obituary in the Broken Bow newspaper mentioned her innovative approach to homestead construction. It didn't specifically mention the firewood vault, because that detail seemed too technical for a general obituary. But the people who'd lived through those early brutal winters, the ones who'd watched her dig that first hole into the hillside in September 1872, they remembered. They remembered because they'd copied what she'd built, because their children had stayed warm using her principles, because in the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival, Martha Hendricks had done the mathematics correctly and shown them how to do the same. The last time anyone saw physical evidence of Martha's original dugout was in 1956, when a farmer was plowing the old Hendricks claim, and his tractor broke through into a cavity about 5 feet underground. He climbed down with a flashlight and found the remains of that firewood vault. Oak support posts still standing after more than 80 years. Rock platforms still intact. Drainage channels still visible and functional. He took some photographs and showed them to his grandfather. The grandfather said she'd been the first to arrive at church in Broken Bow, even after she could barely walk anymore. The grandfather said she'd been the smartest person he'd ever met in his entire life, man or woman, educated or not. Said she'd understood things about building and weather and survival that people with engineering degrees from universities couldn't quite grasp. The farmer eventually filled in that cavity because he couldn't leave a hole in his wheat field. But he kept those photographs. His grandson still has them stored away somewhere. Faded black and white images showing oak beams and limestone foundations, and the clear evidence of engineering that outlasted most of the wooden structures built during that same period. The dugout is gone now. The firewood vault is filled with soil and covered with crops. Martha has been dead for more than a century. But the principle she demonstrated so clearly, that preparation beats desperation, that knowledge weighs nothing and costs only effort to acquire, that the skeptics are often wrong and the quiet innovators are often right. That principle doesn't age or decay or become obsolete. It's as valid today as it was in 1872. The technology changes, The tools improve dramatically. But the fundamental truth remains constant. When you're facing a Nebraska blizzard at 42 below zero, the person who prepared correctly survives comfortably. The person who mocked that preparation freezes or burns their furniture or loses fingers to frostbite. And the person who learns from watching that difference, who sets aside pride and pays attention to results rather than assumptions, they become the innovator for the next generation. Martha Hendricks dug a hole in the ground and kept her firewood dry through 4 consecutive brutal winters. Her neighbors laughed at her until they stopped laughing. Then they copied exactly what she'd built. Then they taught their own children to do the same. That's how wisdom actually survives across generations. Not through preservation in books or museums, but through use, through proof, through the kind of brutal, honest testing that winter provides equally to everyone, regardless of pride or prejudice or preconceived notions about what should or shouldn't work. You can build something right, or you can build it wrong, but the blizzard doesn't care which option you chose. It only reveals which choice you actually made when it mattered most. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with Martha's story until the end. These accounts of frontier survival aren't just history lessons. They're reminders that practical wisdom and careful preparation still matter, that the person everyone underestimates today might be the one who shows us how to survive tomorrow. If you'd like to continue with another story about people who built solutions when no one else believed in them, there's more waiting for you here on the channel. Take care of yourself and remember that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important messages.